The HOA thought they had won. They bulldozed James's bridge in broad daylight, laughing as the wooden beams cracked and sank into the water. But what they didn't know was that the bridge wasn't just a walkway. It was built over the floodgate his father had hidden decades ago. And when James turned that rusted wheel under the lakebed, the water didn't just ripple, it roared. Within minutes, the lake that fueled the HOA $8 million resort would begin to drain like a bathtub. Tourists would scream, boats would capsize, and Karen Whitfield, the iron-fisted head of the HOA, would stand frozen on the dock, powerless as everything she had fought for slipped away with the current. But to understand how it all began, we need to go back to the morning the HOA first crossed the line. James was sipping his coffee on the porch of his cabin, the same porch he had sat on every morning for the past 20 years. The lake stretched before him, calm and golden under the rising sun. His wooden bridge arched gracefully across the inlet, its beams weathered but strong, standing as both a landmark and a memory. His late father had built the original structure with his own hands. Together, they had rebuilt it when storms damaged it, plank by plank, side by side. It wasn't just a bridge. It was family history, but the rumble of heavy machinery shattered the peace. James set his mug down and narrowed his eyes. A convoy of trucks rolled toward his property, led by none other than Karen Whitfield. With her designer sunglasses, clipboard, and sharp stride, she looked less like a neighbor and more like a general leading her troops into battle. "Morning, James," she said coolly as the machines parked near the bridge. "You might want to step aside. Today's the day." James felt his stomach drop. "What do you mean, today's the day?" Karen smirked. "The board voted unanimously. That bridge is a hazard, and it doesn't comply with HOA regulations. We're demolishing it." James's fists clenched at his sides. "That bridge is on my land. You don't have the authority." "Oh, but we do." Karen cut him off, holding up her clipboard like it was a royal decree. Section 14, Article 3. Any structure visible from the main road must meet community standards. Yours doesn't. The resort owners have been complaining for years. Consider this problem solved. Behind her, a bulldozer's engine roared to life. "Wait," James shouted, his voice breaking. "That bridge is mine. My father built it. You can't just." The machine lurched forward, steel jaws biting into the wooden frame. A thunderous crack split the air as the first beam gave way. James's heart sank with it. He stood frozen, powerless, as the bulldozer tore into the bridge. Planks snapped, nails screeched, and chunks of wood splashed into the water below. By the time the dust settled, nothing remained but jagged stumps protruding from the shore like broken teeth. Karen turned to James, brushing imaginary dust from her blazer. "You'll thank us one day. We just saved you from a lawsuit waiting to happen." James didn't answer. He couldn't. His throat was tight, his chest heavy. That bridge wasn't just timber. It was his father's legacy, his childhood, his peace. And in less than an hour, it was gone. Karen smirked one last time. "Enjoy your view, James. It looks much better without that eyesore." Then she and her entourage marched back to their cars, leaving James standing in the ruins of his past. He stared at the water for what felt like hours, the silence broken only by the lap of waves against the shore. But beneath that grief, something darker began to stir, a thought, a memory, a secret his father had once told him, whispered late one night as they worked under the stars. "Son," his father had said, pointing to the hidden stone wall at the base of the inlet, "this lake was man-made. Our family helped build it back in the day. Behind this wall is the dam's floodgate. Never forget it's here if you ever need it." James had never thought he'd use it. Until now, the HOA thought destroying his bridge was the end, but James knew it was only the beginning. That night, James walked to the water's edge with a flashlight in one hand and his father's old wrench in the other. What he was about to do would change the lake forever. If you think James should fight back against the HOA after what they did, make sure to hit that subscribe button. Trust me, you won't want to miss what he does next, because the real shock is only just beginning. That night, when the lake was still, and the moonlight shimmered across its glassy surface. James moved quietly along the shoreline with nothing but a flashlight in his hand, and his father's heavy wrench tucked under his arm, his heart pounding with every step as if the earth itself were warning him to turn back. But he he wouldn't, because the HOA had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, and now the only thing louder than the croaking frogs and rustling reeds was the echo of his father's words in his mind, "Never forget, son. It's here if you ever need it." And James knew that it was waiting for him right beneath the waterline at the far end of the inlet, where the lake narrowed into a stone wall, hidden behind decades of moss and reeds, a secret gate that had built the very lake the HOA worshipped and profited from, a gate his grandfather and father had helped install when the government first flooded the valley to create this man-made paradise. A gate no one else seemed to remember existed, except James. He knelt at the edge, brushing away vines, his flashlight beam catching the glint of rusted iron, and there it was. The wheel, large and corroded but still intact, bolted into the stones like some ancient relic, its purpose forgotten by the world but alive in his memory. James's hands shook as he touched it, the cold metal biting into his skin, and for a moment he hesitated, because he knew this wasn't just a matter of revenge. It was a choice that could alter the lives of everyone around the lake, from the resort owners who catered to wealthy tourists, to the families who had built lakeside cabins, to the very HOA that had dared to call his father's bridge an eyesore. He could almost hear Karen's smug voice in his ear, lecturing about aesthetics and liability, and the memory ignited a fire in his chest, so strong that hesitation turned into determination, and determination into action. He placed the wrench firmly on the wheel, twisting, pushing with all his weight, his muscles straining against years of rust and neglect until finally, after a groan like the moan of some sleeping giant, the wheel budged just an inch, but enough to release a whisper of bubbles from beneath rocks, a warning that the ancient floodgate still lived, still had power. James froze, staring at the rippling water, his heart racing with both terror and exhilaration. And in that moment he realized he held the fate of the entire community in his hands. The thought alone was almost intoxicating. After years of being pushed around, fined, and humiliated by the HOA, he was no longer powerless. He had the ultimate leverage. He could drain the very lake they worshipped, the lake their $2 million resort depended on, the lake that gave Karen her false sense of superiority, and he could take it all away with the turn of a wheel. But James wasn't reckless, not yet. He pulled the wrench back, tightening the valve again just enough to stop the bubbles, testing it, confirming it still worked, and then he sat there on the cold stone wall with the moon reflecting in the water, his mind racing with possibilities. He thought of the resort, with its neon lights and noisy jet skis that shattered the lake's peace. He thought of the HOA board members who signed away his bridge without a second thought. He thought of his father, who had built this bridge with sweat and pride, and who had whispered to him about this very gate, not as a weapon, but as a safeguard, a reminder that nature's balance could always be reset if people pushed too far. And now, hadn't they? James wiped the sweat from his forehead and stood, his decision not fully made, but his resolve hardening with every heartbeat. He wouldn't act recklessly. He would wait, plan, make sure that when the moment came, the HOA would feel the weight of what they had done, and they would understand that they hadn't just destroyed a bridge. They had awoken something they could not control. He walked back to his cabin in the shadows, but little did he know, the faint grinding sound of that rusted wheel had not gone unheard, because across the water, in the flickering glow of the resort lights, someone had seen his silhouette, wet by the dam, and by morning, whispers would spread like wildfire. By sunrise, the HOA would start asking questions, and one board member in particular would knock on James's door, demanding to know what exactly he had been doing by the dam the night before. The sun had barely risen when a sharp, insistent knock rattled James's cabin door, pulling him out of a restless sleep filled with visions of splintered bridges and rushing water, and as he dragged himself to the entryway, rubbing the grit from his eyes, he wasn't surprised to find not a neighbor with a friendly face, but Victor Mallory, the HOA vice president, a man who usually played second fiddle to Karen but whose nervous energy suggested he had broken ranks. His tie was crooked, his hair damp with sweat, and he leaned forward like someone carrying a secret too heavy to bear, whispering urgently the moment James opened the door, "I saw you, James, last night by the dam." James's heart skipped, his body tensed, but he kept his face calm, replying flatly, "I don't know what you're talking about," though the steel in his tone betrayed nothing of the panic flickering in his chest. Victor darted a look over his shoulder as if afraid Karen herself was lurking nearby, then stepped closer, lowering his voice further. "Don't play games with me. I know what's under that lake, and if Karen finds out you touched it, she'll destroy you." James leaned against the doorframe, studying him, realizing in that moment that Victor wasn't there to threaten. He was there to plead because, unlike Karen, Victor remembered the history of the land, the government contracts, the engineering projects, and the whispers that the lake wasn't as permanent as people thought. "Why are you telling me this?" James asked carefully, and Victor swallowed hard, his eyes darting back toward the shimmering lake. "Because if you open that floodgate, it's not just the resort that will suffer, it's everyone. The HOA will lose everything, yes, but so will the families who bought their dream cabins here. The resort may deserve it, Karen may deserve it, but do the children who swim in that lake deserve it? The fishermen? Do the people who just wanted peace?" His words hung in the air like a heavy fog, and for a brief moment James faltered, because he had spent the night convincing himself that draining the lake was poetic justice, a way to make the HOA feel the pain they had inflicted on him. But now Victor's warning forced him to confront collateral damage, the ripple effect of his choices. Still, James wasn't ready to abandon the thought, not after the humiliation he endured watching his bridge torn apart. He stepped closer to Victor, lowering his voice so it carried the weight of a vow. "You think I'm reckless, Victor. You think I'd do something without a plan. They took something from me they had no right to touch. That bridge wasn't just wood. It was my father's legacy. If I act, it won't be out of anger. It'll be because they left me no choice." Victor stared at him, pale and uncertain, then whispered, "Karen is already suspicious. She told the board you were standing at the shoreline last night, staring into the water like you were plotting something. She wants to call an emergency meeting. You're on her radar now." The words hit James like a jolt of electricity. Karen, always watching, always waiting for a reason to tighten her grip, was already spinning her narrative, painting him as the villain before he even moved. "Let her call her meeting," James muttered, jaw tight. "The more she talks, the more she reveals how afraid she is." Victor hesitated, then leaned closer, his voice trembling with urgency. "Just promise me, James, whatever you're planning, don't do it. Don't give her the satisfaction of proving she's right about you." And with that, Victor turned and hurried down the gravel path, glancing back once, as if to confirm James wasn't following, leaving James alone with the echo of his warning. Inside, James sat heavily at the kitchen table, staring at the wrench still lying there, the same tool he had used to test the gate, and he knew Victor wasn't entirely wrong. Draining the lake would hurt innocents as well as the guilty. But wasn't that always the HOA tactic? Punish one to control all. The thought twisted like a knife, fueling his determination. He wouldn't rush, but he also wouldn't retreat. He would make his move when the time was right, when it would expose Karen and the board for what they truly were, tyrants masquerading as community leaders. Yet as he sat there, lost in thought, another sound broke his concentration, the low hum of engines. James rose, peering through the window, and his blood ran cold. Across the water, at the resort docks, Karen herself had arrived, flanked by uniformed workers and a survey team, pointing at the shoreline near the dam with exaggerated gestures, her voice carrying even across the lake as she barked, "Orders!" Whatever she was planning, it was already in motion, and for James the realization was clear. She wasn't just suspicious, she was preparing to strike first. And when James saw the heavy machinery rolling toward the dam under Karen's command, he knew she wasn't just investigating, she was about to uncover the very secret he had sworn to protect. By the following afternoon, the lake no longer felt like a serene retreat, but a construction site buzzing with tension, as Karen Whitfield, in her crisp white blazer and oversized sunglasses, stood on the dock barking commands into a walkie-talkie, her voice sharp enough to cut through the hum of diesel engines, and James, watching from his porch with binoculars, felt the chill of realization crawl down his spine. She wasn't bluffing this time. She had brought in contractors with excavators, survey crews with clipboards, and even divers in wetsuits ready to plunge beneath the water near the dam, and though the average resident strolling along the lakeside path might have thought it was just routine maintenance, James knew exactly what she was after. Proof that the dam existed, proof that he had touched it, proof she could spin into another HOA violation to strip him of whatever rights he had left. He watched as the divers disappeared beneath the surface, bubbles rising in frantic bursts, and he could almost picture their hands brushing against the very wheel he had tested, the iron relic his father had entrusted to him, and the thought made his pulse quicken with both fear and fury. Karen strutted back and forth like a queen overseeing her empire, waving her manicured hand at the workers, shouting, "Check every inch. If there's anything down there, I want it documented and photographed. We cannot allow one man to endanger this community with hidden structures." Her words carried across the water, deliberately loud enough for James to hear, and though he clenched his jaw to keep his composure, inside he burned at the hypocrisy. She spoke of safety while her true motive was power, of community while she schemed to protect the resort's profits, of liability while she had single-handedly destroyed his bridge without notice or cause. Still, he forced himself to think clearly, because panic would only hand her victory, and so he studied every movement, every piece of equipment, calculating how long it would take for them to discover the moss-covered gate, how quickly word would spread once Karen had her photographs, and how ruthlessly she would use that discovery to paint him as a threat to the entire neighborhood. Hours passed, the sun dipped lower, and the workers grew restless, their progress slowed by the sheer weight of silt and stone built up over decades. But Karen's determination never wavered. Her heels clicked against the dock as she leaned down to berate the divers when they surfaced. Her voice sharp, "Keep looking. I don't pay you to come up empty-handed." James exhaled slowly, weighing his options, and he remembered Victor's warning, the plea not to let anger dictate his choices, but watching Karen command that army of contractors, he realized the window for subtlety was closing. If she found the gate, she would take control of it, lock it up under HOA authority, and strip him of the one card he had left to play. The thought was unbearable. He paced inside his cabin, staring at the wrench on the table, listening to the distant rumble of machines, until a sudden idea crystallized in his mind. Not to run, not to confront her directly, but to act before she did. To prove to the entire community that the power she sought to monopolize was never hers to wield. He grabbed his flashlight, his boots, and the wrench, his determination hardening with every step toward the shoreline, because if the floodgate was to be exposed, it would be by his hand and not by hers, and he would control the story, not Karen. But as he reached the edge of the water, he froze, because across the lake, in the last amber glow of sunset, he saw Karen holding up something dripping wet, triumphant, shouting to her board members who clapped like sycophants, and even from that distance James could tell what it was. A chunk of iron, jagged and rusted, broken loose from the stone wall, proof enough that she was dangerously close to the truth. His stomach dropped, his palms slick with sweat, because if she had already pulled up a fragment, then the rest was only moments from discovery, and once she had that proof, she would rally the HOA, call in county officials, and twist the narrative until James became the villain she had always painted him to be. And as James gripped the wrench tighter, staring across the lake at Karen's victorious smile, he knew he had only one choice left: open the floodgate before she could claim it as her own. Night fell heavy and thick over the lake, the kind of darkness that swallowed sound and sharpened every glint of moonlight on the restless water. And James, standing at the dam's edge with his father's wrench clutched in one hand, felt his pulse echo in his ears as though the earth itself were warning him that what he was about to do could not be undone. Yet the image of Karen's smug smile holding that rusted fragment burned behind his eyes, fueling him with a sense of urgency that drowned out doubt, because he knew if she managed to claim the floodgate first, she would lock it away under HOA control, twist the truth, and declare herself savior of the lake while branding him a criminal. But if he acted now, on his own terms, the story would belong to him. The wheel loomed before him, slick with moss, its spokes groaning with the weight of decades, and he could almost hear his father's voice guiding his hands, reminding him of the engineering hidden in those stones, the simple but unstoppable force of water held back by iron and willpower. And James whispered, almost as a prayer, "This is for you, Dad." He set the wrench against the wheel and pushed, muscles screaming, sweat dripping, the metal shrieking in protest until suddenly it shifted, first an inch, then another, then half a turn, and the ground beneath his boots trembled as bubbles exploded to the surface like the lake itself was gasping for air. A low rumble followed, deep and primal, rolling through the valley like distant thunder, and James staggered back as a gush of water surged out from beneath the stones, at first a trickle, then a torrent, frothing and churning as it clawed its way downstream, and within moments the once placid lake began to stir, its surface pulling inward as though some invisible hand had gripped the plug of a giant bathtub. Across the water, lights flickered on at the resort, shouts carrying faintly through the night as tourists stumbled onto balconies, pointing in confusion at the swirling currents, their laughter from earlier replaced with cries of panic as boats tethered to the docks slammed against each other. James stood frozen, chest heaving, half exhilarated and half terrified at the sight, because though he had dreamed of this moment, he had not truly believed the power hidden beneath the dam could roar back to life so quickly. The shoreline began to widen as water receded, reeds bending under the sudden pull, and the resort's shimmering reflection shattered into chaos as the lake's surface dipped lower and lower. He could see Karen herself now, her white blazer glowing in the spotlights, her arms flailing as she barked orders no one seemed to understand, workers running in every direction, some shouting to shut off pumps that had no connection to the floodgate, others scrambling to tie down boats as waves grew violent, and in the chaos James felt a grim satisfaction. Finally, Karen wasn't in control. But even in that satisfaction, a sharp pang pierced him. Victor's words, the warning about collateral damage, the families who loved this lake, the children who swam in it, the fishermen who depended on it, and as the water rushed past the floodgate in an unstoppable torrent, James realized he had unleashed something far bigger than revenge. He gripped the wrench tighter, considering whether to close the gate, to slow the flood before the damage became irreparable. But before he could make that choice, a spotlight beam swept across the dam, blinding him, and a booming voice from across the water rang out through a megaphone. "Step away from the structure, James. You're destroying community property." His heart lurched. Karen had called the sheriff, and the deputies were already at the resort, their patrol boat cutting across the waves toward him, lights flashing, sirens wailing faintly in the distance, and for the first time James felt the weight of not just what he had done, but what would come next if they reached him before he could decide his next move. And as the patrol boat's spotlight locked onto him, the floodgate roaring at his feet, James had to make a choice. Fight to finish what he started, or shut it all down before the law branded him a criminal forever. The sirens grew louder as the patrol boat surged closer, its blue and red lights strobing across the churning water like a warning beacon, and James, his boots slick with spray from the unleashed floodgate, felt the enormity of his act pressing down on him as if the weight of the entire lake now rested on his shoulders, because in the sheriff's eyes he wasn't a grieving son reclaiming his father's land. He was a saboteur who had just put half the community at risk. Karen's shrill voice cut through the night like a blade, amplified by the megaphone she had snatched from a deputy. "That's him. Arrest him. He's destroying everything we built." Her words rang false even in the chaos, but she delivered them with such practiced venom that the crowd gathering at the resort balcony gasped and pointed, turning James into the villain in their eyes. The patrol boat crashed against the current, two deputies bracing themselves with rifles slung across their chests, and James's pulse pounded because he knew one wrong move could mean handcuffs, or worse. "James Miller." The sheriff's voice boomed, deep and commanding, cutting through Karen's theatrics. "You have 30 seconds to shut that gate before we take action. This is your last warning." The demand echoed across the valley, mingling with the roar of water, and James tightened his grip on the wrench, torn between defiance and self-preservation, because every second the gate stayed open, the lake drained deeper, the resort's lights flickered harder, and the HOA empire cracked wider. Then, to his shock, Victor appeared on the far ridge, his silhouette framed against the moon, shouting over the chaos, "Sheriff, you're chasing the wrong man. Check the records, check the deeds. That gate doesn't belong to them, it belongs to him." The words hit like a lightning strike, freezing the deputy's mid-motion, and even Karen faltered, her face twisting as though someone had yanked the mask off her lies. The sheriff narrowed his eyes, signaling for his men to hold, and through the megaphone he demanded, "What deeds? What records?" Victor raised a leather-bound folder high over his head, its papers whipping in the night air. "The original survey maps and ownership documents your office ignored when she filed her bogus claims." His voice cracked with urgency, and James felt a surge of hope. But Karen, pale with fury, screamed from the resort dock, "Those papers are forgeries. Don't listen her. Arrest him before he drowns us all." The crowd erupted in shouts, some siding with Karen, others murmuring doubt as they watched the lake shrink before their eyes, the once idyllic surface now a raging funnel dragging docks and boats into the current. The sheriff raised a hand for silence, his eyes never leaving James. "You've got two options," he said coldly. "Shut that gate now and come quietly, and I'll look at those papers before charges are filed. Or keep it open another second, and I swear I'll drag you out in irons and let a judge decide whether you ever walk free again." The ultimatum cut straight through James, a blade between his ribs, because the wrench trembled in his hands, his father's voice echoing in memory, whispering about legacy, pride, and standing tall against corruption, but his heart hammered with the realization that one wrong decision could bury him under fines, prison, and shame forever. The roar of the floodgate grew louder, like the lake itself urging him to defy, and yet the sheriff's eyes bore into him with grim finality, no room left for delay. James's breath came ragged, the spray soaking his shirt, his fingers tightening until his knuckles went white, and then, slowly, deliberately, he began to turn the wheel back, the grinding metal shrieking as the gate inched toward closing, the current easing, the fury of the water beginning to settle into a reluctant calm. Gasps rose from the crowd, Karen shrieking triumph as if she had won. But before James could let go, the sheriff's boat bumped against the dam wall, deputies leaping onto the stone, their boots thudding as they closed in. One grabbed his arm, yanking him back, the wrench clattering against the stone, and cold metal cuffs snapped onto his wrists with a finality that chilled him to the bone. Karen's victorious cry echoed through the night, "Take him away." But before the deputies could haul James off, Victor raised the folder again, his voice raw with fury. "Sheriff, if you take him without looking at these papers, you're complicit in her crime." The sheriff hesitated, his jaw tightening, torn between procedure and truth, his gaze flicking between Karen's manic glare, Victor's desperate defiance, and James standing cuffed by the roaring gate. The silence stretched, broken only by the hiss of draining water, until finally the sheriff growled, "Bring me those documents, now." And as Victor sprinted toward the dam with the folder clutched tight, Karen's eyes flashed with pure terror, for she knew if those papers reached the sheriff's hands, her entire empire could collapse in an instant. The next morning, the small-town courthouse overflowed with people, the story of the drained lake and HOA collapse having spread like wildfire overnight, drawing reporters, angry resort guests, and curious neighbors who wanted to see the fallout with their own eyes. And as James was led into the chamber still in handcuffs, the murmur of voices rippled through the crowd, some whispering words of support, others still believing Karen's venomous accusations. At the front sat Judge Whitmore, a stern man known for cutting through theatrics, his gavel striking hard as the bailiff called the room to order, and standing proudly at James's defense table was Victor, holding the weathered folder of deeds and maps like a holy book of truth. Karen entered moments later, dressed in a pristine white suit that gleamed under the courthouse lights, her posture sharp and haughty, as if she still controlled the entire neighborhood, and her entourage of HOA board members scurried behind her, their faces pale with dread. The sheriff stepped forward first, recounting the chaos of the night before, but when he admitted under oath that Victor's documents appeared authentic and bore county seals dating back decades, the courtroom shifted, eyes darting toward Karen as cracks appeared in her armor. Victor rose with fire in his voice, spreading the maps across the table so the entire gallery could see the original survey lines proving the dam, the floodgate, and the bridge all rested on land owned by James's father, land the HOA had never legally touched. "They tore down his bridge without a permit," Victor thundered, his voice echoing, "then smeared him as a criminal when he defended what was rightfully his. This wasn't just abuse of power, it was theft dressed as law." Gasps and murmurs swept the gallery, but Karen stood with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, claiming the papers were outdated fabrications, and accusing James of orchestrating the flood as a vendetta. But then, in the moment that shifted everything, a former HOA board member rose unexpectedly from the back row, his voice trembling as he confessed, "She knew the land wasn't ours. She told us to bury the survey maps and push through anyway because the resort deal would make her rich." The room froze, the judge's gavel slamming to silence the eruption, and Karen's mask finally cracked, her confident smirk twisting into rage as she hissed threats at the man who betrayed her. Judge Whitmore leaned forward, his voice cutting through the storm. "Mrs. Karen Holloway, this court has heard enough. Not only did you and your board act outside your authority in demolishing private property, but you attempted to manipulate law enforcement, falsify claims, and exploit the community you swore to represent. Effective immediately, this HOA is dissolved, its assets frozen, and you will answer to civil and criminal charges." The courtroom erupted, reporters scribbling furiously, townsfolk cheering, and Karen screaming as deputies seized her arms, her white suit stark against the black of their uniforms as she was dragged from the chamber in disgrace. James, still cuffed, felt tears sting his eyes, not from fear anymore but from release, because for the first time in years he saw his father's honor restored, their land protected, and the community freed from Karen's iron grip. The judge ordered his release on the spot, the cuffs clattering to the floor, and when James turned, the crowd that once doubted him now stood in applause, neighbors pressing forward to shake his hand, some even apologizing for siding with the HOA lies. Outside, the drained lake shimmered under the morning sun, its muddy banks raw but ready for rebirth, and James realized that what the HOA saw as destruction was really a chance for renewal. With Victor at his side and the law finally on his side, he vowed not only to rebuild his father's bridge, but to restore the lake in a way that served everyone, not just a resort, not just an elite HOA, but the entire town. And as the cameras rolled and the community rallied behind him, James walked down the courthouse steps free, his father's legacy intact, while behind him Karen's furious screams faded into the jailhouse walls. Her reign over the Lakeside community ended forever. But just as James thought the battle was over, a letter arrived days later from a corporate developer who had quietly funded Karen's schemes, and they weren't about to let the lake slip from their grasp without a fight.